Hi, welcome to the Joi of Sewing. I'm fashion sewer Joi Mahon, and I hope you have been enjoying all of our episodes on learning the basics of sewing. One important aspect of sewing is fabrics. So we're going to look a little bit in depth here, but give you just the foundations of what you need to know when you're picking out your fabric, understanding fabrics, and how about elastic? What is elastic, and is elastic actually a fabric? Let's go ahead and start looking at the structure of fabric. Now, I have a kind of a funny looking piece of fabric here that I'm going to put out on the table for you to look at. And this has a diagram on here. Before you ever pick out any kind of fabric, it really is important to understand a few very basic fundamentals on how fabric is made. Now, in looking at the lines that are on here, there's a very dark bold kind of purple blue line, which would be the warp. And you're not probably going to hear that word, but you will hear a word called salvage. And when you go to the fabric store and you're purchasing fabric, it's going to be on a bolt or a tube, some sort of roll, and you're going to buy it by the yard. So fabric is always sold by the yard. And when you purchase that, it's going to be unrolled and you're going to have a long edge to the fabric. That is the strongest part of the fabric, and the yarns that go up and down. This is really important because when you're sewing, if you want the sturdiest part of the fabric going a certain direction on your garment, you're going to want to make sure that you lay your pattern pieces out so that they go in that same direction. The red lines would indicate the yarns that go crosswise to that warp. They're strong in a woven fabric, but they're not as strong because they're not quite as close together as these vertical lines would be. So just be aware of that as you're sewing. When you develop your skills, you can use more of this to your advantage. The biggest thing you need to know now is that there is a salvage or warp yarn that goes vertically the length of your fabric. The last thing I want to point out is the little dotted line here, and this is what is called the bias. If you've never sewn before at all, you do not want to start sewing anything on the bias, but it's a great tool for cutting mini patterns, and what happens is that goes at a diagonal line to our straight of the grain or our salvage. And see how if I pull this fabric right here on that tight warp or salvage line, it's very, very tight. If I go and pull at an angle, look how that stretches. And this is not a stretchy knit fabric, but any fabric that is pulled at a diagonal will have some stretch to it. That can be a good thing in your sewing projects. That can be a bad thing if not used correctly. I personally love sewing on the bias. An example would be making a top that drapes and hugs the body, or maybe using that around a neckline or in a sleeve. If you have a fuller arm and you want a sleeve that's going to maybe stretch with your arm, you can lay your pattern to utilize that. The only thing you want to pay attention to is if you happen to have a fabric that has a stripe or some sort of print. So if you're interested in the bias, that might be something that you try to tackle later on, but let's stick to the basics for right now. I am going to fold this and we're going to talk about where you get your fabrics. That's probably one of the #1 questions that I have when I go around teaching, because unfortunately a lot of fabric stores are closing around the country and we're kind of stuck with usually big box stores that sell, not a whole line of fabrics or none at all. So I'm a big fan of utilizing the internet and fabric swatches. This is just one example of a swatch book. This is a paid service that you can purchase. It's about $30 a year and you get 6 catalogs, and it has all kinds of matching fabrics that are really great. Here I have some circled because I was really interested in purchasing that. And they come for all of the seasons. So these have brighter colors. This is more geared towards spring and summer. But I love swatch services. You can also look online, and there are a lot of companies. Make sure you just check the resources for this video. I'm going to put some of my favorite fabric sources in there. So there will be just some great references for you. Most companies will send you swatches at no charge. Now, they're not going to send you hundreds of swatches, but if you're looking for fabric fabrics to maybe make a skirt or a jacket, you might be able to pick out 6 or 10 different fabrics, and they're probably going to send you a little swatch. Sometimes it's a little square, sometimes it'll be just a little snippet off the end of a bolt, but that's a really great way to test a fabric and see if you like it before you purchase sight unseen. I'm going to give you a few tips for how you pick out your fabrics and working with fabric companies mail order. I suggest developing a really good relationship with maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 of your favorite companies, maybe one that fits your price point, and then start getting to know them. If you can call in and say, "Hi, this is Joi," and then they recognize who you are and they start to learn what types of fabrics you purchase mail order, then they're more likely to know exactly what you need when you call them. An example would be if you liked to sew denim and you ordered denim from the same store every time. You might be able to call them and say, "Hi, this is Joi. I'm looking for a particular color. Have you seen that?" And then they can maybe special order for you. And so you can use that to your advantage. Ordering fabric isn't always about saving $1. Now, there are all kinds of price points when you purchase fabric, from a few dollars a yard to hundreds of dollars. When you're first starting out, please don't feel you need to buy the very top of the line, but you just want to make sure that you purchase a quality fabric. So unfortunately, you're probably not going to want to purchase something that's $1 or $2 a yard, just simply because the quality is not going to be there. I usually say a good price point for beginners, and this is just a very loose scale, is like $8 to $15 a yard. That can change, give or take $1 or $2. But what you're going to find is that, take a denim, for example, or a material that would be like what you would sew a pair of jeans or shorts out of, usually run anywhere from $8 to $12 or $14 a yard, as opposed to maybe finding something that's $1 or $2. You're going to find a better weave, which is what we just talked about in the diagram, better yarns, your fabric is going to be more straight, and you're going to have a better luck sewing your garment, and chances are that it's not going to shrink, maybe even not wrinkle as much. So those are all things that we want to think about. I hope that seems pretty basic. It really, when you're picking out your fabrics, sometimes it's just making good choices. Work with your fabric supplier, check our resources for some places to purchase fabric. And then the last tip I would say is that as you're starting to learn to sew, I would recommend using 1 to 3 or 4 particular types of fabrics and do several projects using those particular types of fabrics until you become more confident in your sewing skills. And from there, you can then graduate into other types of fabrics. I think one of my favorite things about sewing really is picking out my fabric. I'm going to pull a bolt here and show you exactly what it looks like when you're buying something at a fabric store. But some people design or sew around a pattern. I design and sew around fabric. I love feeling the textures and looking at the colors and combining, things that maybe you wouldn't think go together, and you bring them together in a project and they look amazing. To me, that's really exciting. So I really appreciate just going and feeling fabric and being inspired. Let's take a look here. I have a bolt of fabric, and fabric is going to come in a couple different widths of fabric. So when you go to the store, you're going to purchase fabric by the yard, and which is 36 inches, but fabric may come in different widths. And that's really important. In a later episode, we're going to talk about how we pick out our pattern and how much fabric to get. But just know that the width of your fabric is going to be usually 44, 45 inches wide. A lot of cotton fabrics are made that way. And then a lot of fashion garment fabrics are usually 58 to 60 inches wide. I've even had some bolts that are 63 inches wide. So sometimes there's a little bit of discrepancy depending on the factory and the loom that they were made on. Fabric usually is on a bolt, so we've got a little cardboard bolt here, and the nice thing about the bolt is that you're going to have, let's look at that. Whoops, here we go. there's going to be a label on the end of the bolt. And so it's going to tell you how wide your fabric is. That'll be written on there. Let's see here. Yep, right here, 4344. So that's good to know. It's a little bit narrower. It usually is going to have the pattern number, the company that it came from, a color, even a SKU. That's really important because maybe you find a bolt of fabric and you love it, but maybe somebody else loved it too, and they've already purchased most of it, and you need 3 yards and maybe there's only 1 yard left. You can take this up to the clerk at the store and then ask them if they can order an additional bolt of this fabric. If they can't, then you can possibly go online. Now, one thing about purchasing fabric is, number one, first and foremost, try to support your local dealer. That's imperative so that these fabric shops stay open. When I say mail order, I like to order from companies that have tangible physical stores. And you can again reference the fabric resources that go along with this lesson. But that's really important because you then do want to be able to check out these fabrics in person. All right. Let's navigate our fabrics as well. I mentioned earlier in the structure of the fabric about that salvage edge, and we have that right here. The salvage edge also tells us the brand of the fabric. Sometimes here's our registration. There's usually a registration of colors. You can use that to help you pick out the matching thread because you're going to be able to take those over to the thread rack and find something that matches or find coordinating fabrics just by looking at the registration colors. And that's all the colors that are included in this particular fabric. Now that's kind of unique to cotton fabric, so you may not always have that in fashion garment fabrics, but sometimes you'll run into that. So you may or may not see that. But anyways, so here is our bolt of fabric. When you're a new sewer, I know a lot of sewers will gravitate to quilting cottons to do some basic projects like a pair of shorts or a pillowcase or a skirt, kids' clothes. Go ahead and do that. I think they're wonderful. I like to stick to licensed brands of cotton fabrics just because the quality is a little better. So again, you want to avoid the $1, $2 quilting cottons that you might find at a box store just simply because the dyes are different. They're going to fade when you wash them. The grain is all kind of askew and the fabric's not straight on the bolt. So if you stick to like some reputable licensed brands, you're going to have great success. And a cotton fabric is a really great one to learn on because it's not going to shift around or anything like that. Let's set that aside and go ahead and look at some fun fabrics here. Okay, this is actually a garment weight denim fabric. It's not in the color that you would find off the rack when you're buying your blue jeans. And I think when you start sewing, you'll find that denim comes in all kinds of colors, which really opens up your sewing options. Let's look here. So our salvage edge on our denim is not as decorative as our quilting cotton. But the one thing about the salvage is that it's the tightest part of the fabric. That's where the fabric was held on to the loom when it was made. So when you actually go to sew your garment, you want to avoid putting pattern pieces right next to that salvage because it's very tight. And we'll talk about that in our pattern section. But denim is a great, and this is very lightweight, so great fabric to learn on. Now, before I show you some other woven fabrics, which are fabrics that don't stretch, let's talk about fabrics that you do not sew on a sewing machine. This is one of my favorite fabrics that I use in my studio, and it has all kinds of sequins, and there's some very chubby beads that are on here. You would not want to sew this with your actual sewing machine. Otherwise, you would just be turning the hand wheel for each stitch. So some fabrics you actually simply just sew by hand. So be aware of that. These kind of things look beautiful and really enticing as a new sewer, but you might want to avoid them just because they're probably going to give you a little hiccup or headache until you're more comfortable with your sewing skills. So just be aware of that. Now, on the other hand, This is a really fun fabric. It has a great detail to it. It has a little bit of stretch to it, but I would say, you know, if you're really, as a new sewer, wanting to try some of these really pretty fabrics, this might actually be an okay one to try because it's soft. The embellishment that's on there is basically made from the same fabric, so you can sew over that and you're not going to break needles like you would if you're sewing over beads or anything like that. So if you're really, you know, wanting to jump into something decorative, try to keep it something that's all cloth and very soft and still not slinky. All right. Speaking of slinky, this fabric right here actually is made of silk. And when you're purchasing your fabrics, you're going to run into fibers. What's the fabric actually made of? We have some cotton denim material. This one actually I didn't mention, but is polyester. So that's not a manufactured or a man-made fiber. And then this is actually a silk. So this is spun from silkworms. And that's probably a lesson for another day. Silk is actually a really interesting fabric to learn about. And there can be some very stable silk fabrics. There can also be some very slinky silk fabrics. This would be one. I would not recommend using something very drapey and slinky as your first sewing project because we want to take a little more care in being able to cut our patterns and sew with this. So avoid really, really slinky fabrics until you're more comfortable with your sewing abilities. Let's talk about knits. Knit fabrics. These are fabrics that, unlike our woven ones that have a selvage and a grain, our knits are woven with interlocking loops. Think of your grandma making you or knitting you a scarf or a sweater. It's kind of the same idea. So knits are very, very stretchy. And everyone, just about everyone owns knit clothing. I usually don't recommend a beginning sewer to start on knit fabrics right away until you grasp basic sewing fundamentals with your woven fabrics. So keep your knits for maybe your third or fourth project, but the same thing with knits. Just understand that you have, let's look at this stripe, for example. This is a knit, but it's not slinky, whereas this knit's very slinky. So if you wanted to start a knit sewing project, I would maybe use something that had some more stability to it. Here, I have a pair of knit yoga pants. And this is a class that I teach for beginners. And this is actually a really great project for a new sewer. There are specialty machines for sewing knits and also specialty needles. So in a previous episode, and you'll want to go back and reference that, we talked about different needles and how we sew on knits with our machines. But basically, there's just a few things you need to change in order to sew these fabrics. And you can also utilize the great machines called sergers, which do decorative stitching like this. But again, that's something that you can aspire to after you get through some of your basic sewing projects. There are so many fabrics that I can show you. Here's a really pretty one. It's kind of shiny. I think our eyes gravitate to really decorative things. But again, this one has a really slippery finish to it. It will make a beautiful blouse. But if it's your first sewing project, maybe stick to something a little bit more durable. And then you can move on to some of these slippery fabrics. Here's a good one. This is a really great way to kind of combine decorative fabrics with a slippery texture for a beginner. All right, there's a shine to it, but it has really great body. And this is just a polyester decorative matte satin. So it has just a little bit of a satiny, shimmery edge to it, but it's not real stretchy. It has great body. You would have great success with the first sewing project in that. And it's a little more fun maybe than just a plain cotton. The last thing I think that I want to point out when kind of evaluating your fabric is to pay attention to, again, where you buy your fabric, but how it's made. This sample right here looked really pretty on display. I picked this up at a big box store because they had some cute holiday sequin fabrics, and this looked really tempting. From afar, it looked like it would make a really cute little top to go with the sequin jacket. And so for fun, I purchased this, but upon really evaluating it, it's not a good fabric at all. I think I would have trouble sewing this. It has kind of a icky finish to the top of it, so although it's shimmery, it's really not very nice. It's a bit of a knit fabric in how it's made, so I just think that this is got a lot going on to it. So just again, be careful. We might be drawn in by some of these decorative things, but stick to something a little better quality. All right. So I asked the question, do you know what elastic is? And is elastic a fabric? Now, to be technical, things like trims, and you can buy these in your fabric store, little packages of lace pieces that you can sew on a hem or a seam or the edge of fabric. There's some seam binding here. This is a really great thing to sew, maybe if you're doing a shoulder seam to prevent it from stretching. Little twill tape here. You're going to run into things like this in your fabric store in the notions section. Technically, these are considered fabric because they are made on a loom. It doesn't matter that they're not wide. It's just kind of an interesting little tidbit or nugget. So just know from the technical standpoint, it's kind of fun to know that even elastic, which is stretchy, is actually a fabric. It's usually sold as a notion, and that's not really going to affect anything when we're sewing our projects, but a fun little thing to know. That these are extra things that we can put into our garments to make them even better. And maybe in future lessons, we'll incorporate some of these too. If you want to post a question in the comments below asking how you might use some of these, that would be great. We can answer that and talk about some creative uses for those other things that aren't necessarily considered fabrics. All right, we're almost done getting through the basics here. The other thing in the fabric section that you might find or on the back of your pattern envelope will be interfacings. And these are fabrics that go inside a garment. Think of it as like your foundation or your underwear of your garment, basically. The fabric is the outer portion of a garment, but sometimes you need something in there to help create like a collar that maybe stands up, or you need to make a fabric that's slinky. Let's see here. Well, take this knit, for example. So if I wanted to sew this and maybe I wanted to put a button in there, it wouldn't be enough just for me to sew a button through one layer of this knit because it's probably going to put a hole in there or pull out or tear. So I might use something like an interfacing on the inside of the fabric or the garment to help add some stability. And there are all different kinds. There are woven interfacings. This is one of my favorites. It's called a Siri. And then we have interfacings that are knits. This is also one of my favorites called a fusy knit. And then this is a little bit heavier fabric that you can put in like a coat. And here's a little tip for you. If you have one of those really slinky fabrics that you really, really love and you really want to sew it, I would recommend affixing it to an interfacing to add a little bit more stability, and then that'll help you get through your project a little better. And interfacings come in different colors as well. Typically gray, black, kind of a neutral color, because they're meant to kind of be a buffer between the fabric and the skin. But that's something that you're going to run into as well. All right, I have a really fun illustration for you. The last thing that you're gonna wanna look at is the nap of the fabric. Now, this is my daughter's 4-H project, but I thought it was such a great way to illustrate nap. And we're gonna point that out in the next lesson where we're talking about patterns. But your pattern is gonna tell you if you have fabric that has nap, you need to purchase more. And that's the reason is because fabric has a direction to it. Now, not all fabrics do, but something like a fur, a corduroy, a velvet, those all have a direction. It's kind of like those sequin pillows. You rub the pillow one way and the sequins look flat, and you run them another way and then they're all shiny. The same thing. So here we have a couple pieces of some faux fur, and they're like fabric buddies. But if you run your hand one direction, you can see how smooth, see, it even moves with you. Thus the idea of the little eyeballs. These are really meant for kids. But as you run your hand one direction, the fur is going one direction. If you run your hand the other direction, see how that fur stands up? So if you made a garment and you had one pattern piece going one direction and another pattern piece going another direction on the front of your body, it might look really funny. So when you're cutting your pattern pieces, just pay attention to the texture of your fabric on the top side, and if it has some sort of nap or it's actually called pile to the fabric, you want to make sure when you lay your pattern pieces on there that they're all going the same direction. I thought that would be a fun illustration for you. I hope this has given you some good tips and tricks for picking out your fabrics. We want to make sure that you know if your fabric is a knit, which is stretchy, or a woven. You want to check the quality of your fabric, and then if it's slinky, if it's non-slinky. You can order fabric swatches to test out before you even purchase your yardage. Check our resources for that. And I hope you pick out a great fabric for your first sewing project. In our next episode, we're going to take a look at sewing patterns and how to navigate all the information that comes in that tiny little envelope. We'll see you then.